The crowded aisles of the local supermarket were filled with the usual sounds: the hum of the refrigerators, the beeping of the checkout counters, the occasional chatter of shoppers making small talk as they picked up their groceries. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, but in the blink of an eye everything was about to change. Keanu Reeves, the man everyone recognized but couldn't quite place in their everyday lives, stood in the produce section, carefully selecting a bunch of bananas. His usual calm demeanor was unshaken as he casually glanced at the apples nearby. Little did he know, the moment he stepped into this supermarket, he had unknowingly become the center of attention. As Keanu turned to leave the aisle, a sudden voice cut through the hum of the supermarket. "Stop right there!" The command was sharp and filled with authority, but it wasn't directed at anyone around him. No, it was aimed directly at Keanu Reeves. He paused, turning slightly. The voice came from Officer Jack Harris, a police officer standing at the end of the aisle, a hand resting on the side of his gun. There was no immediate explanation, no "excuse me, sir," to soften the abrupt demand. Just the cold, demanding tone. Keanu raised an eyebrow, still holding his bananas. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, trying to gauge what was happening. His tone remained even, his body language relaxed. This was Keanu Reeves, after all, used to all sorts of odd situations due to his celebrity. But this felt different. "Step away from the cart," Officer Harris ordered, taking a step closer, his hand now visibly tightening around the holstered gun. There was a tension in his voice that couldn't be ignored, a raw hostility that seemed out of place in such an everyday setting. Around them, the atmosphere began to shift. People stopped in their tracks, whispering nervously, unsure of what was going on. Phones slowly began to rise, capturing the scene unfolding before them. Was this some kind of joke? Or was something much more serious happening? Keanu stood still. For a moment, his mind racing but his face expressionless. He knew that being a public figure meant people often mistook his intentions. But this felt different. Harris wasn't just confronting him, he was targeting him. For what reason? "Why are you doing this?" Keanu asked, still not raising his voice. His calmness seemed to only frustrate the officer more. "Don't ask questions. Just do what I say," Harris snapped, his voice now tinged with anger. The crowd around them seemed to grow, their eyes shifting nervously between the two men. No one dared to interfere. No one knew if they should. The tension was palpable, and the unexpected nature of the encounter had everyone frozen in place. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Keanu's cool, collected persona clashed with Harris's erratic behavior. The officer's grip on his weapon tightened, his eyes scanning the people nearby. No one knew what was about to happen next, but the air was thick with an undeniable sense of danger. What could possibly make an officer point his gun at a man like Keanu Reeves in the middle of a supermarket? And then, in a voice barely above, a whisper. Someone in the crowd asked the question that would change everything. Why him? It was a question that no one seemed to have an answer for. As Keanu looked around, he saw the faces of the people standing in shock, their phones recording. Every second, the possibility of what could happen next felt terrifyingly real. Could one wrong move, one misstep, escalate things into something far worse? Keanu's mind was sharp. He was no stranger to confrontations, but this one was different. This time, it wasn't just about defending himself, it was about something far bigger. What would happen next? Would Keanu be able to defuse the situation, or was the moment already slipping out of his control? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The silence was deafening. Keanu could feel the weight of the gun in Officer Harris's hand, even though the officer hadn't fully drawn it yet. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm just before it hits. The crowd held their breath, waiting, unsure of what to do. People began whispering among themselves, eyes darting between Keanu and the officer. Phones were still up, capturing every moment. Keanu's calm gaze never wavered. He wasn't panicking. If anything, his mind was calculating the next few moments. He had been in the public eye for years, accustomed to the pressure of being watched. But this felt different. Something about the officer's attitude was off, and Keanu couldn't put his finger on it until now. He could see it in Harris's eyes. It wasn't just about following protocol. There was something personal there. "You got the wrong guy, officer," Keanu said, his voice steady but firm. He didn't flinch, didn't take a step back. "I don't know what you think is going on, but I'm just here to buy groceries." For a second, Harris hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied Keanu. The officer's hand remained near his weapon, but he hadn't drawn it completely. He was trying to decide something, whether to escalate or de-escalate. "You're making a mistake," Keanu continued, his voice softer now but no less assertive. He wasn't just talking to Harris, he was speaking to the crowd, to anyone who might be listening. He could see the unease in the faces of the people around them, the confusion and fear. He had to stay calm, not just for himself, but for everyone who was witnessing this bizarre situation. Harris's jaw clenched, his posture stiffened, and Keanu could see the officer's tension building. "You don't tell me what I'm doing," Harris growled. His hand finally gripped the gun tightly enough for the handle to shift beneath his palm. The scene was spiraling towards something that neither of them could control. The crowd started to murmur louder now. Someone gasped. Another voice shouted, "What's going on?" And someone else shouted something that made the situation even more complicated. "Isn't that Keanu Reeves?" Keanu couldn't help but notice how the officer's eyes flicked toward the person who'd yelled. It wasn't the revelation that Keanu was famous that seemed to bother him. It was something deeper, something more personal. Keanu's fame had nothing to do with this, but for Harris it might have been more than just an encounter with a celebrity. "I'm not your enemy here," Keanu said, taking a half step forward, trying to close the distance in a peaceful way. "I'm not the one you're looking for. If you're looking for someone, I suggest you—" "Shut up," Harris snapped, his voice rising, finally stepping forward aggressively. "You think I don't know who you are? You think I don't know exactly what you stand for?" His eyes were wild now, and there was an edge to his words that made Keanu's stomach tighten. The gun was still in his holster, but Keanu could feel it, the heavy, dangerous possibility of the situation escalating. Keanu paused. "What exactly do you think I stand for?" he asked, trying to keep the tone neutral. He needed Harris to think, needed him to step back from the precipice, but the officer didn't want to think. His mind was already clouded with something far deeper than this encounter. Jack Harris had a history. Keanu could feel it in the air, something personal, something racial. Harris's anger was unhinged, and it wasn't just about the situation at hand. It was about something far more complicated. Keanu knew he had to be careful. He wasn't just facing an officer, he was facing a man who had let his biases fester, who had let them dictate his actions. And right now, Keanu had no idea how far Harris was willing to go. A voice broke through the tension, this time with authority. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Keanu turned his head just as a new figure appeared. Chris, his longtime friend and manager. Chris had been standing at the back of the store, his eye-catching presence now making its way through the crowd. He wasn't as famous as Keanu, but his stature and the calm in his demeanor gave him the kind of confidence that only comes from years of navigating high-pressure situations. Keanu saw the slight relief in the eyes of the people around them. Maybe Chris could diffuse this. Harris looked at Chris, sizing him up for a moment before his gaze flicked back to Keanu. "Mind your business," he muttered. Chris took a few more steps forward, his voice steady but firm. "We need to get this under control now." He shot a glance at the people around them who were still recording. "You know what'll happen if this escalates, right?" Keanu's heart was racing now, but he kept his face neutral. He needed to keep everyone calm, keep himself calm, while things spiraled around them. It wasn't just about getting out of this unscathed. It was about not letting this turn into something far more dangerous. "Jack," Chris said quietly, now standing next to Keanu, "you've been under investigation for months. You really want to make this worse?" Harris stiffened at the mention of the investigation, his hand faltering on the gun again. His eyes flicked around, then quickly darted back to Chris. "Get out of my face," Harris growled, but there was no conviction behind his words anymore. It was clear now that his facade was cracking. The truth was coming out. The crowd, watching, in silence, seemed to realize that something bigger was at play here. something they hadn't seen at first. Keanu stood still, his body slightly turned toward Chris, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for his own safety, he was fighting to make sure that no one else, no one in that crowd, would see violence erupt in front of their eyes today. "What's going to happen now?" someone whispered from the crowd. "Is this going to turn into another story of police brutality?" Keanu glanced at Chris, who gave a subtle nod. "It's not too late to do the right thing," Chris said, looking directly at Officer Harris. It was a quiet moment, but the whole supermarket seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for Harris to make his move. What would he do now? The tension in the air felt as if it could snap at any moment. The entire supermarket was on edge, eyes locked on the confrontation between Keanu Reeves, Chris, and Officer Jack Harris. The buzzing of phones, recording the incident, seemed louder than ever. The flashing lights of video cameras cutting through the dim lighting of the aisles. Everyone was waiting for the next move. Keanu remained calm, his face still composed, but his mind was sharp. He could feel the weight of the situation. The officer's hostility was palpable, and Keanu knew that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was personal. But what exactly was the root of it? Why had Harris singled him out? Why the sudden hostility, especially toward a celebrity in a place where everyone should feel safe? Chris, standing by Keanu's side, didn't flinch. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Harris's growing agitation. But Chris knew something others didn't. He knew the history. "Jack," Chris said, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving the officer. "This isn't the way you want to handle this. You've already made it clear you don't like him. But this isn't the way. You're going to make it worse for yourself, and you know it." Harris's face twisted with frustration. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes flicking from Chris to Keanu, then back again. His hand still hovered near the gun at his side, though it wasn't drawn yet. The more he stood there, the more his internal conflict seemed to gnaw at him. He didn't want to be seen as weak, but his own fear and anger were clouding his judgment. Keanu could see it in his eyes, a man torn between what he thought he knew and what he was too afraid to face. Keanu glanced around, noticing the eyes of the crowd still on them. People were trying to stay out of it, but there were murmurs growing, louder. Some were calling the police, others were debating what to do next. Keanu felt the pressure. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the tension that was now simmering beneath the surface, a reminder of the issues plaguing the world outside these supermarket walls. "Why me, Jack?" Keanu finally asked, his voice quiet, but cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Why target me like this? What's the real reason?" For the first time, Harris's face softened ever so slightly, his grip loosening on the gun. His jaw clenched, and there was a brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The question seemed to hit him harder than he expected, as if he hadn't considered it himself. Chris stepped closer to Harris, his voice low but firm. "This isn't about Keanu, it's about you, Jack. You've been carrying something for a long time, something you've let define your actions." The officer's gaze faltered as he looked at Chris, clearly unsettled by the implication. His shoulders sagged just a little, but he didn't respond. The silence between them stretched out, thick, with the weight of the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Keanu could sense the change in Harris. There was something there, something dark and uncomfortable, but it wasn't about what Keanu had done. It was about what Harris had been carrying with him for years. The officer wasn't just acting out of professional duty. There was something deeper, more personal, and it was now unraveling right before them. "I've been watching you for a while," Harris finally muttered, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "You and your Holman life, what you stand for. It's all an illusion, a lie, a perfect little world where everything's neat and clean, but not everyone gets that luxury, do they?" Keanu's heart sank as the truth began to take shape. It wasn't about a mistake. It wasn't about Keanu's actions at all. It was about a man who had allowed bitterness to fester inside him for too long. The officer had been holding on to some misguided belief that Keanu, a public figure known for his kindness and compassion, represented everything Harris couldn't have. Everything he resented. Chris's voice broke the silence again, calm but insistent. "Jack, you can't just act out of your own hate. You've been part of this system for too long. You know better than anyone that you can't treat people this way." The officer's face contorted, but the weight of Chris's words seemed to resonate. His eyes flicked to the crowd, and for the first time, Harris seemed aware of the cameras, the dozens of people who'd been watching this entire spectacle unfold. He was losing control, and it wasn't just Keanu or Chris who saw it, it was everyone around him. Keanu felt the shift. This wasn't just a physical standoff anymore. This was a reckoning. "Get back," Harris suddenly snapped, as though trying to regain some semblance of authority. But it wasn't convincing. His voice lacked the confidence it had before. His hand moved away from the gun for just a moment, but it wasn't enough to diffuse the situation entirely. The crowd had already started to murmur again, some even, speaking up louder now. "Why is this happening?" someone asked from the crowd. "Is this really happening right now? This is Keanu Reeves. Why is he being treated like this?" Keanu's gaze swept across the sea of people. Some were confused, some frightened, and some were simply angry. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment. This wasn't just going to be another story on the news. This was bigger than that. People weren't just seeing the celebrity they admired. They were seeing a man who was caught in the middle of a much larger issue, a problem that was bigger than both him and the officer, bigger than the supermarket aisles. Keanu turned his attention back to Harris, who was still struggling with his own inner demons, clearly conflicted. It was a struggle that had been going on for far too long, long before today. "You don't have to do this," Keanu said softly, his voice gentle yet firm. "You can make the right choice. You can walk away from this." For a brief moment, everything paused. The air hung heavy with tension as everyone watched, holding their breath. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Harris spoke again, his words full of pain and regret. "I don't know how to fix this. I've been doing this all wrong, Keanu." And Chris exchanged a brief look. The officer hadn't fully let go of his anger, but the wall he had built up was starting to crack. The crowd was watching, waiting for him to make the next move. Could he step away from the brink? Would Harris choose to break free from the hate that had been driving him for so long? The moment of decision was here, and the entire supermarket was holding its breath, waiting for the answer. The seconds felt like hours. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmurs of the crowd barely audible over the pounding of Keanu's heart. Officer Harris stood before him, still gripping his holstered gun, his face a mask of confusion, guilt, and uncertainty. Keanu could see it all. Harris wasn't just a cop in a supermarket anymore. He was a man torn by his own inner conflict. The weight of his choices, his actions, and his prejudices seemed to have caught up with him all at once. Keanu took a slow, measured step forward, careful not to make any sudden movements that might send the officer into panic mode. "You're not alone in this," Keanu said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "We all carry things with us, things that make us afraid. But you don't have to carry this anger anymore. It's not too late to change." The officer's eyes flickered with a mix of disbelief and vulnerability. It wasn't just the moment, it was the words themselves that seemed to hit him. Harris had lived so long under the weight of his biases, his prejudices, and his fear, and now, in this one moment, Keanu was offering him an escape, a chance to stop being the man he was and choose to be something better. The crowd around them had fallen eerily silent, all eyes trained on Harris. Phones continued to capture every fleeting second, but for once no one seemed to be thinking about getting the perfect shot. They were waiting for a resolution, waiting to see if this encounter would devolve into chaos or if it could somehow become something better. "I don't know how," Harris muttered, his voice cracking. "I've been a cop for so long. I've seen things, done things I can't take back, and every day it's harder to remember who I am under all that." His hand trembled slightly as he slowly let go of the gun, lowering it to his side. Keanu could feel the tension shifting, the overwhelming power of this moment. Harris wasn't just a threat anymore. He was a man trying to make sense of the life he'd lived, one that had been filled with mistakes, regrets, and the crushing burden of his own choices. It was clear now. This wasn't about Keanu or fame. It was about the officer's own struggle with himself, with the system, and with the people he had been taught to see as other. Keanu stood there, no longer a celebrity in the eyes of the crowd, but a person trying to make a difference. He wasn't offering sympathy, Nor was he offering judgment. He was offering the chance to step away from the darkness. "You don't have to fix everything in one day," Keanu said, keeping his voice gentle but resolute. "But you have to start. It starts with letting go of the anger, the fear. It starts with understanding that we're all human. We all make mistakes and we all have the ability to learn." The crowd was still, watching as Harris's face softened, the anger and fear that had once clouded his expression beginning to dissipate. Harris's hands were no longer hovering over his weapon. Instead, his fingers clenched and unclenched, as if trying to release years of tension. His breath hitched, as if he was struggling to process what Keanu was saying. Chris, standing beside. Keanu took a small step forward. His voice was calm but firm, his eyes never leaving the officer. "Jack, you've made a choice today. You've got a chance to do the right thing, to stand up and be better. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Harris looked at Chris, then back at Keanu, the realization of what he had almost done beginning to sink in. His face flushed, his hands shaking now more visibly. I don't know where to start," Harris admitted quietly. "I've been angry for so long. I don't know how to let it go." Keanu nodded. "It takes time, it takes effort, but it starts with moments like this, with being willing to listen, to understand, and to change." For a moment, everything was still. The tension that had gripped the room began to loosen, but there was still that sense of unease in the air. Would Harris take the chance, or would he walk away, leaving everything unresolved? The crowd stood in silent anticipation, as though the resolution of this situation was going to mean something much larger than a simple encounter between a celebrity and a police officer. Then, slowly, Harris took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as if releasing the weight he'd carried for years. He let out a long exhale, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice was softer, less angry. "I'm sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. His eyes met Keanu's, and there was a hint of something else in them now. Regret. Maybe, but also the faintest glimmer of hope. I'm sorry." Keanu smiled gently, his eyes meeting Harris's in a shared moment of understanding. "It's okay. You've made the first step. That's what matters." The crowd seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. It wasn't the explosive confrontation they had feared. It was something different, something more difficult, but more meaningful. The officer had taken accountability for his actions, and though the road to redemption wouldn't be easy, this was a beginning of change, of growth, for both him and those around him. For a moment, Keanu's mind flashed to the people around him, to the lives affected by the systemic issues that had brought this situation to a head. This one moment, this one decision, wouldn't fix everything, but it had the power to spark something bigger. "You don't have to do it alone," Keanu added, his voice warm. "If you want help, you can ask for it." Harris nodded slowly, a new resolve in his eyes. The gun that had once been a symbol of power now felt unnecessary, as if the officer had finally realized the true source of his strength lay not in his weapon, but in his willingness to change. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some still unsure of what they had just witnessed, others quietly nodding in approval of the resolution. The cameras lowered, but the effect of the moment was undeniable. Something had shifted, something had been healed, at least in part. As Keanu and Chris walked away side by side, Keanu glanced back at Harris one last time. The officer was standing, staring at the ground for a long moment, his expression one of deep reflection. Keanu couldn't help but feel that this small act of compassion might just be the spark that someone needed to make a difference. To start a conversation that could change lives, sometimes it just took one moment, one step, one decision, to change the course of everything. And as Keanu exited the supermarket, he felt a sense of hope rise inside him. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The aftermath of the confrontation spread like wildfire across the internet. What had started as a tense, potentially violent encounter between a police officer and Keanu Reeves had turned into a moment of unexpected reconciliation. It wasn't just the people who had been there in the supermarket who were talking about it. Now millions around the world were reacting to what had happened. Social media was flooded with hashtags like a Keanu Reeves, change is possible, and ice and justice and compassion. People were sharing their thoughts, reactions, and opinions, dissecting every moment of the incident. For Keanu, it had all happened so fast. His calm demeanor had kept things from escalating, but it wasn't just about the public spectacle. It was about the message behind it. People weren't just seeing a famous actor standing up for himself. They were seeing someone stand up for humanity, for change, and for the possibility of growth even in the most difficult of situations. As Keanu sat in his car, parked on the side of the road, his phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. He glanced down at his screen, seeing texts from close friends, public figures, and even complete strangers offering words of gratitude and support. One message stood out to him, though. It was from Chris. You did something today. Something. Real. I know you didn't want all this attention, but you've sparked something. People are listening. Keanu felt a pang in his chest. He wasn't someone who enjoyed being in the spotlight, and yet in that one moment, he had made a choice to stand up and be heard. It was never about him. He knew that. It was about something bigger. It was about the system, the way people treated one another, the way that fear and anger could blind someone to the possibility of compassion. He had been able to reach Harris, but how many others were out there who needed to hear that same message? As the media frenzy grew, so did the discussions surrounding the root causes of what had transpired. News outlets and talk shows invited experts to discuss the nature of police misconduct, systemic racism, and the ways in which fear often leads to impulsive actions. But there was one thing no one could ignore. The moment between Keanu and Officer Harris had sparked a much-needed conversation about compassion, personal growth, and the ability to change. It wasn't just a headline, it was a shift in perspective. In the days that followed, Keanu stayed out of the public eye, not because he didn't want to engage with the ongoing conversation, but because he knew that this moment wasn't about his fame. It wasn't about him at all. It was about people realizing that they had the power to change, that they could choose empathy over fear, that they could choose understanding over judgment. But even as he stayed out of the spotlight, Keanu knew that the conversation had only just begun. People were still talking, still asking questions, still looking for answers. Chris had suggested something the night of the incident. He had said that Keanu needed to turn this moment into action. It wasn't enough to just let it be a viral story. Keanu knew Chris was right. People needed more than just words. They needed tangible steps toward real change. That's why, a week later, Keanu made a decision. He called a meeting with Chris. The two of them met at a local cafe, sitting in a small booth in the corner, away from prying eyes. Keanu had spent hours thinking about what he wanted to do, and now he was ready to take that next step. I can't just let this moment slip away, Keanu said, stirring his coffee absently. People are listening, people are talking, but we can do more than just have conversations. We need to take action, we need to create something real. Chris nodded, his eyes focused. You've got the platform, Keanu. The spotlight's on you right now, but I'm not talking about just creating awareness. We need to bring people together, have some kind of forum, something where people from all walks of life, police officers, community leaders, activists, everyday citizens, can come together and talk, listen to each other, learn from each other. We need more dialogue and less division. Keanu's eyes lit up at the suggestion. A forum, a place where people can talk. No judgment, no cameras, just conversation. Exactly, Chris said. You can't change the system overnight, but you can start by creating an environment where people feel safe enough to speak, and not just speak, but really listen. Maybe it's not the whole world, but if you start with a few, it'll ripple. Hout? Keanu sat back, taking in the idea. A forum wasn't just an abstract idea. It was something tangible, something people could engage with. It would allow individuals to share their experiences, their pain, their hopes, and their ideas for real solutions. It wouldn't be an easy conversation. There would be discomfort, there would be disagreements, but there would also be understanding, and that was what Keanu wanted to foster. We'll call it the bridge, Keanu said, after a moment of thought, a small smile forming on his face. A place where we can start building connections, where we can cross the divide. Chris grinned, clearly impressed. That's a good name. The Bridge. It'll symbolize what you're trying to do. A space for people to cross over from fear to understanding. Keanu nodded. Exactly, let's make it happen. The days that followed were filled with planning, phone calls, and the quiet work of making the forum a reality. Keanu knew he couldn't do this alone. He reached out to a variety of individuals, community leaders, social workers, law enforcement officers, and activists, to help make the event happen. The goal wasn't to have a simple discussion. It was to open up a space where people could heal, where they could find common ground and seek ways to change the system that had allowed so much division. The forum would take place in a neutral location, far from the flash of media cameras, where real, honest conversations could happen. Keanu wanted it to feel organic, raw, and sincere. There would be no grand speeches or rehearsed answers, just people sitting together, talking. For me, Keanu, this was the next step, a chance to take the conversation to a new level, to turn a moment of tension and potential violence into something transformative. It was a risk, a leap of faith, but Keanu knew it was the only way forward. As the date of the event drew closer, Keanu couldn't help but think back to the moment, in the supermarket, to the way things had nearly spiraled out of control, the way Harris had almost pulled the trigger. And yet, in that moment, a chance for redemption had emerged. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way to turn things around. And with that thought in his mind, Keanu looked ahead to the forum, the bridge, the beginning of something new. This time, he wouldn't just be watching the change happen. He would be helping to create it. The day of the forum arrived, and Keanu found himself standing in front of a modest, yet powerful gathering of individuals. The venue wasn't glamorous. There were no red carpets, no flashing cameras, no high-profile guests. It was a simple community center, nestled on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The walls were adorned with banners reading, "Building Bridges," not walls and "Let's listen to understand, not to respond." It wasn't about making a statement through grandeur. It was about making a statement through the people who would walk through the doors. As Keanu arrived, he saw the space was already filling with a diverse group of people: activists, community, organizers, law enforcement officers, local politicians, and ordinary citizens. A mixture of hope, apprehension, and even skepticism hung in the air. Would this be just another empty conversation, or could something real, lasting, and meaningful come from this? Keanu felt the weight of it all. He was here to facilitate, not to dominate the conversation. He wasn't looking for accolades or validation. What mattered was that people felt safe enough to share their experiences, their fears, their ideas for a better future. It had to be real. It had to be raw. The room was large, with chairs arranged in a circle, everyone seated on equal footing. It wasn't a panel discussion where one person spoke while everyone else listened. This was about dialogue, not monologue. Chris, who had been by his side since the supermarket incident, walked over and slapped Keanu lightly on the back. "You good?" he asked with a grin. Keanu nodded, though a nervous energy buzzed under his skin. "As good as I can be. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." "I think you're right," Chris said, looking around at the gathering crowd. "But if anyone can get this thing off the ground, it's you." Keanu smiled, though it was tight. "Let's hope so." As people continued to filter in, Keanu noticed that some attendees exchanged wary glances. Others were deep in conversation. There were police officers, some who had been in the force for decades, others who were just starting out. There were community leaders, activists, and even people who had been directly impacted by police violence. The diversity in the room reflected the diversity of the issues they were about to address. Once everyone had gathered, Keanu stepped to the front of the room, his heart beating in his chest. It wasn't a stage, no spotlight to frame him. It was just a group of people who had come together because they all wanted something to change. Keanu took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room, before speaking with quiet sincerity. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know that for many of you this is not easy. Some of you might be here because you feel the need to speak up, others because you feel the need to be heard. We all come from different places, we all have different experiences. But what unites us today is that we all want change. We all want to see a world where we don't have to be afraid of one another, where we can work together, where we can understand each other. He paused, looking around the room. Every pair of eyes was fixed on him, some skeptical, others eager, but all of them waiting. I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers. I don't, he continued. But what I do know is that it starts with understanding. It starts with listening to one another. It starts with seeing each other as people. Before anything. Kels, he let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Keanu wasn't there to lecture anyone. He wasn't there to tell them what they should do. He was there to facilitate the kind of conversation that could plant the seeds of change. I'm here to listen as much as I am to talk, he said softly, and I hope you'll do the same. The silence in the room was palpable, but it was not uncomfortable. There was a sense of anticipation. This was the beginning of something important. The first person to speak was Officer Jack Harris, the same officer from the supermarket incident. He stood up slowly, his uniform still pressed and crisp, his face a mixture of humility and apprehension. I'm here because I made a mistake, Harris began, his voice hesitant. What happened that day? It's something I'll never forget. I've been a cop for over 15 years. I've seen things that no one should have to see. I've dealt with people who've made me fear for my life, but that doesn't justify what I did that day. There was a collective breath drawn by the room. Harris's words weren't just an apology, they were a reckoning. He was not just acknowledging his mistake. He was opening himself up in front of a room full of strangers, admitting his vulnerability, and acknowledging the harm he had caused. I didn't realize how much fear had clouded my judgment, and I didn't realize how much my fear was based on things I had been taught, things I'd seen over the years, Harris continued. But I also know that's not an excuse. I can do better. I need to do better. The room was quiet for a moment as people processed his words. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't even a perfect beginning, but it was a start. I'm sorry, Harris finished, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. And I'm here because I want to listen. I want to understand how to be part of the solution, not the problem. A woman in the audience stood up, her expression guarded, but her voice strong. I respect that you're here, Jack, she said, her words deliberate. But you can't just say you want to do better. You have to show it. You have to put in the work. It's not enough to just apologize. What are you going to do about it? Keanu watched as Harris took in her words, his eyes not defensive but accepting. He nodded, as if the weight of her statement had landed. I understand, he said. I'm not here to offer empty promises. I want to learn, to be a part of the change. I'm open to that. From there, the conversation began. A back and forth that was at times difficult, at times uncomfortable but always honest. People shared their experiences, some painful, some filled with hope. Others expressed their anger, frustration and fear, but it was always rooted in the desire for something better, for a world where they could all walk side by side. Without fear, Keanu didn't speak much. He listened, he let the room breathe, let people process their thoughts. It was messy. There were moments of tension, of people speaking over one another, of raising voices, but there were also moments of calm reflection, of understanding, of moments when someone said something that made the whole room pause and think, that's it, that's the first step. By the end of the evening, something had shifted. The conversation wasn't finished, far from it, but a foundation had been laid, the beginning of a bridge between opposing sides. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wouldn't solve all the world's problems in one night, but it was a start. As the event wound down, Keanu found himself standing near the door, watching the people leave. Some exchanged numbers, some spoke quietly to one another, while others remained lost in thought, processing the weight of what they'd shared. Keanu's heart swelled with quiet hope. This wasn't about him. It was about the people in that room, the people who were willing to sit down and have the hard conversations. It was about breaking down the walls that separated them and opening up the possibility for a new kind of dialogue. And in that moment, Keanu knew that the bridge they had started building wasn't just in the room. It was a bridge that could extend far beyond it, across cities, across communities, across lives. A bridge not of division but of connection, of understanding, of hope. And that, he thought, was just the beginning. The weeks following the forum were a whirlwind. Keanu could feel the weight of the conversations still lingering in the air, like a slow-moving tide that would eventually reshape the landscape. He had known that initiating a forum like the bridge would not instantly solve everything, but he didn't expect the aftermath to feel so profound. The discussions weren't just staying within the walls of the community center, they were spreading across social media, local news outlets, and even larger national discussions. The initial skepticism that some people had felt about the event was quickly turning into a wider understanding of its importance. Keanu had made it a point to continue to check in with the participants, especially Officer Harris. Their conversations had been open, but there was still so much ground to cover, so many hard questions left unanswered. For Harris, the change wasn't just something he had to think about in the abstract, it was personal. He had to confront his own biases, his own upbringing, his own blind spots, and that wasn't something that happened overnight. But as the days passed, Harris reached out to Keanu more and more, asking for guidance. At first it was small things, suggesting books to read, sharing articles about community policing, engaging in deeper discussions about systemic racism in law enforcement. But gradually, Harris began to show up at local community events, talking to people who had been impacted by the very system he had once been a part of, making himself vulnerable, by asking questions instead of making assumptions. Keanu had spent his life in front of cameras in the limelight, but this was different. This was about people who were, for the first time, willing to do the hard work behind the scenes, and Keanu wasn't sure if the journey would lead to complete reconciliation or if it would uncover even deeper divides, but he knew that what they were doing mattered. He had received hundreds of messages from people who had attended the Bridge Forum or had seen the media coverage afterward, sharing their own experiences and struggles. Some praised the initiative, others criticized it, questioning whether anything could truly change. But Keanu realized that the criticism wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign that people were engaged, people were talking, the most important. Part of the journey had already begun. They were listening. One afternoon, as Keanu was sitting in his office at home, he received a call from Chris. The urgency in his voice made Keanu's heart race. "Keanu, we need to meet." "There's something you need to see," Chris said, the tension evident in his tone. "Okay, what's going on?" Keanu asked, standing up and walking toward the door. "I'll tell you when I see you. It's about Harris," Chris replied, then hung up before Keanu could respond. When Keanu arrived at the cafe where they had first discussed the bridge, Chris was waiting for him. His face was serious, his eyes tired. "Talk to me," Keanu said as he sat down across from his friend. Chris leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't know how to say this, but we've had some unexpected fallout from that forum." Keanu's stomach dropped. "What kind of fallout?" "Some people are taking the idea of the bridge to places we didn't intend," Chris said. "Some community members are upset that Harris, a cop, is involved at all. They're calling it a betrayal. They say it's not enough for him to just show up and apologize. They want actions, real, lasting change, not just words. And that's fair. But what they're missing is that this is a starting point, not a quick fix." Keanu took a deep breath. "I knew there would be pushback. Change isn't easy for anyone, but if we give up now, what was the point of it all?" "I'm not giving up," Chris said quickly, "but I am worried about what happens next. Harris is committed, but some people in the community are rallying against him. They don't trust him. And I get it. It's not just about his apology, but he's trying, Keanu. He's trying harder than anyone expected." Keanu thought for a moment. "Then we need to take this a step further. We need to bring more voices into this conversation, people who are part of the solution and not just the problem. Let's give those who are upset the platform to be heard." Chris nodded. "That's the plan, but we need to act fast. This is starting to escalate, and we don't want this to turn into a spectacle where it's all about division instead of understanding." Keanu agreed, and together they made a plan to bring new voices into the fold. They reached out to community leaders, organizers, and activists to join Harris in a new forum, one that focused more on community action than reconciliation alone. This new forum, which would take place in just a few weeks, would not only offer an opportunity for dialogue, but also encourage collaborative efforts to create real change in the community. It was no longer just about sitting down and talking, it was about giving people the tools they needed to take action. Over the following days, Keanu and Chris worked tirelessly to plan the next steps. They were determined to bridge the gap between police officers and the communities they served. But they also realized that a successful transition required the community to feel heard, understood, and validated. People needed to know they weren't just going through the motions. They needed to feel the change happening right before them. As the new event date neared, Keanu reflected on what had happened since the Bridge Forum. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been perfect. But something had shifted. People were listening, questioning, and demanding more. And that, Keanu thought, was a sign of progress. The day of the new forum arrived, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. This time, it wasn't just about conversation, it was about action. The room was filled with people who were ready to roll up their sleeves and make tangible changes in their community. There were breakout sessions where individuals could voice their concerns, offer solutions, and brainstorm ways to hold both the police and community leaders accountable. The sessions were lively, with some participants passionate, others quiet, but thoughtful. Keanu watched as Officer Harris stood side by side with local activists, listening intently to their concerns, nodding, occasionally asking questions. There was no defensiveness, no resistance. It was raw, honest, and above all, hopeful. By the end of the day, Keanu knew they had done something important, not just by hosting another forum, but by creating a space where people could work together toward concrete goals. The journey was far from over, but Keanu felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of optimism, a glimmer of hope. The conversation was not just happening, it was evolving. Change was coming, and it was happening because people were finally, truly listening to one another. And for Keanu, that was a win. The weeks that followed the second forum were a blur of media coverage, community meetings, and growing involvement from both local residents and law enforcement. The conversations that had started in a small community center had grown into something bigger than Keanu had ever anticipated. The second forum had laid a foundation, and the ripples of it were beginning to spread across the city. It wasn't just about Keanu anymore. This was bigger than any single person or event. It was about people coming together, demanding better, and most importantly, realizing that they had the power to drive change themselves. Keanu's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, some from strangers, others from local activists, and even a few from people who had initially been critical of the forums. There were also messages from people who had once felt invisible in their own community, victims of police brutality, or families who had been impacted by the broken system. They were all reaching out to share their stories, and Keanu knew that this was only the beginning. He had become a catalyst for something much larger, a voice for those who had been silenced for far too long. But the road ahead was far from easy. Chris had been right. The pushback wasn't over. In fact, the movement had become increasingly contentious. Some were still skeptical of the efforts being made by law enforcement. Some felt that the reforms were just another attempt to placate the community, not to instigate true change. But Keanu didn't falter. He couldn't. The people who had spoken up, the ones who had come to the forums, were counting on him, and he had to remain steadfast in his belief that this was worth it. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Keanu sat alone in his living room, scrolling through the countless messages. Each one carried its own weight, some filled with gratitude, others with questions or doubts. But as his finger stopped scrolling, he found a message that made his heart stop. It was from Officer Harris. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk." Keanu took a deep breath and clicked open the message. The words were short, but their impact was immediate. "Keanu, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened these past few months. The forums, the meetings, the conversations. Something happened recently that I didn't expect, and I'm not sure how to deal with it yet. I think it's time we talk face to face. There's something I need to tell you." Keanu's mind raced. What could have happened? The sense of uncertainty that hung in the air after the forums hadn't just been about the external forces, but the internal struggles too. Harris had been trying to do better, to truly listen. But Keanu knew that real change wasn't as simple as just attending meetings. It required grappling with deep-rooted beliefs and biases, and those didn't just disappear overnight. The next day, Keanu met Harris at a quiet cafe, far, removed from the media circus and the political spotlight. Harris arrived early, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more somber. Keanu could tell that something had shifted in him. His eyes were tired and his posture was more closed off than it had been in recent weeks. "Jack," Keanu greeted him as he slid into the booth. "What's going on? What's all this about?" Harris looked down at his coffee, his hands wrapped tightly around the cup as if holding onto it for comfort. "Keanu, I don't know how to say this. Things have gotten a lot harder for me recently." His voice was low, almost regretful. "I thought I could do the right thing. I thought I could be part of the solution, but now it feels like I'm being pulled in two directions. I've been getting pushback from both sides, law enforcement, the community. People say I'm not doing enough, or that I'm just trying to look good. And to be honest, I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going." Keanu watched him carefully, sensing the internal battle raging in Harris's mind. "Jack, you're not going to change everything overnight, and you're not going to make everyone happy. Hell, if you're making everyone happy, then maybe you're not doing something right. The people who have been hurt by this system, they're not going to let you off easy. They've been waiting for change for too long to let a single apology fix things. But what matters is that you're showing up, you're doing the work. That's what counts." "I know," Harris murmured, his gaze still fixed on the table, "but it's not just about showing up. I feel like I've opened Pandora's box. Every day it gets harder. I've had officers questioning my loyalty. I've had people in the community saying I'm just part of the system. I don't know how to bridge that gap. I'm stuck, Keanu." Keanu leaned forward, his eyes soft but firm. "You're not stuck. You're just in the thick of it. Change doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come without a fight. But you've already started something important. Don't back down now just because it's hard. If you truly want to make a difference, you have to be willing to fight through the discomfort, through the fear, through the judgment. People are going to test you, they'll doubt you, but that's when you prove you're in this for the long haul." Harris nodded slowly, as if trying to absorb Keanu's words. The silence between them felt heavy, but it was the kind of silence that allowed space for reflection. "I don't know if I can do it alone," Harris admitted, his voice vulnerable in a way Keanu had never heard before. "You're not alone," Keanu replied, his tone unwavering. "You have people who are with you, people who understand the struggle, and you have me. We're all in this together." For the first time in a long while, Harris seemed to breathe a little easier. "Thanks," he said quietly. I think I needed to hear that." The conversation shifted then, and they began to discuss practical ways Harris could continue his efforts, ways he could start rebuilding trust both within his own department and with the community. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But Keanu had a renewed sense of purpose. There was something powerful about being there for someone in their darkest moments, reminding them that the struggle wasn't just about them. It was about everyone, working together, fighting for something better. As they wrapped up their conversation, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, not just in Harris, but in the very fabric of the community. There were more challenges to come, more obstacles to face. But for the first time, Keanu believed that real change was possible. He walked out of the cafe feeling hopeful, knowing that the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but also understanding that they had laid the groundwork for something profound. The ripple effect of their efforts was undeniable. More and more people were beginning to believe that the world could change, that it had to change, and in that belief, Keanu found the strength to keep going. Because he knew, with certainty, that the fight for a better future was worth it. The months after that fateful cafe meeting blurred together in a rush of events, actions, and realizations. Keanu and Officer Harris, once unlikely allies, had become a symbol of what could happen when people from different worlds came together, with a shared goal, real lasting change. The road hadn't been easy and the obstacles were far from over, but Keanu knew one thing for sure. The work they had started was not just about rewriting policies or holding people accountable, it was about transforming hearts and minds. And that was a fight that never truly ended. Keanu had spent the past few weeks working tirelessly with local leaders, community activists, and even local law enforcement, helping to steer the conversation into new, more impactful directions. He'd seen firsthand the power of empathy, of listening when people felt they were being heard for the first time. But he also knew that action spoke louder than words, and that words alone wouldn't bring the changes they all so desperately needed. There were new forums being organized, this time focused on tangible actions, better community policing practices, educational reform, mental health support for officers, and most importantly, creating an environment of transparency where no one felt invisible. It was clear that the city was undergoing a transformation, and Keanu felt a deep sense of pride in being a part of it, though he was careful not to take too much credit. This wasn't about him. This was about the collective effort of every person who had opened their hearts and minds to the possibility of a new future. One morning, as he sat at his desk, scrolling through the plans for an upcoming community event, Keanu received a call from Chris. "Keanu," Chris's voice was bright with excitement. "I think we've got something here. I just heard back from the mayor's office. They want to host a citywide initiative, pulling together all the forums, the police, and the community groups. They want the Bridge Initiative to be the cornerstone of the entire project." Keanu felt a sense of disbelief wash over him. "Wait, what? The mayor's office?" "Yeah," Chris confirmed. "They've been watching what's been happening, and they want to expand it citywide. They want to make this movement a model for the entire state and beyond. They're serious about seeing real change." Keanu couldn't help but smile. "That's incredible. But it's not just about making a big splash. We have to make sure it's sustainable, that it's not just talk. We need to make sure we're laying the foundation for real, everyday change." "I hear you, man," Chris replied. "But think about what this could mean. If we get city leaders, activists, law enforcement, and community members all on the same page, actively working towards solutions instead of just talking about the problems, it could spark a national movement. This could be the start of something huge." Keanu let the weight of those words sink in. A national movement. It was possible. No, it was necessary. What they had started wasn't just about reforming a single police department or hosting a few community events. It was about reshaping an entire system. It was about showing the world that things could change, and that change was driven by those willing to fight for it, no matter how difficult or unpopular it seemed. That evening, Keanu gathered with his core team, Chris Harris, local activists, and a few key community leaders, to discuss the mayor's proposal. The air in the room was filled with energy and anticipation, but also with a healthy dose of skepticism. The bigger the initiative, the higher the stakes. They all knew that with this kind of exposure came a tremendous responsibility. "We have a chance to do something that could affect generations," Keanu began, addressing the room. "But we also have to be realistic. This is not going to be easy. The systems we're trying to change have been in place for a long time, and it won't happen overnight. We have to be patient, and we have to be strategic. We can't get caught up in the rush of the moment. We need to keep our eyes on the long-term goal." Harris nodded in agreement. "I've been on the inside. I know how hard this is going to be, but I've also seen firsthand how much the community is willing to put in. People want change, Keanu. They want to see us put in the work, not just say the right things." "Exactly," Chris added. "We've got to keep that momentum going. This is bigger than us now. We're talking about setting an example for other cities, for other states. We're talking about a national reckoning, and we can't afford to slip up." As the meeting continued, the plans began to take shape. It wasn't just about the forums anymore. It was about building long-term relationships, creating new structures that bridged the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. There would be new community-led police training programs, mentorship initiatives, and continued dialogue between law enforcement and those impacted by it. The focus was clear: Accountability, transparency, and most importantly, trust. A few days later, Keanu found himself back in front of a camera, this time in a press conference held by the mayor. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, and the air was thick with expectation. Keanu stood beside Harris, Chris, and several community leaders as the mayor introduced the new citywide initiative. "This is not just a local project," the mayor said, his voice firm and resolute. "This is a movement that will challenge us to rethink everything we've been told about policing, community safety, and justice. We are committed to making the bridge not just a model for our city, but a national example of what happens when we come together, when we have the courage to confront our problems head-on and take real, actionable steps toward making things right." The mayor paused and the room held its breath. "Today we are laying the groundwork for a new future, a future where every citizen, regardless of their background or the color of their skin, feels safe, heard, and valued. This is just the beginning." Keanu stood in the background, quietly observing. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't need the accolades. All that mattered was that they were doing the work together. And as the cameras flashed around him, he felt something inside him stir, a sense of pride, yes, but also a sense of responsibility. The future was still uncertain. There were battles to be fought, people to convince, systems to be dismantled. But Keanu knew that this was only the beginning. The seeds had been planted. Now they had to grow. And for the first time in a long while, Keanu truly believed that change was possible, that real change was within their reach. The bridge had become something more than just a forum. It had become a movement. And as long as they kept pushing, kept fighting, and kept believing in each other, Keanu knew that the world could and would be better. He smiled to himself as the press conference wrapped up. The journey wasn't over. But together they had made a start, and that was enough. For now it was enough.